with the proceedings this morning. I know that the subject matter that we are talking about is extremely difficult in that it is harsh. This is not something, we are not talking about poetry early in the morning and reflecting on the dew that falls on leaves and flowers. We are talking about a real human issue, an issue that has plagued us for a very, very, very long time. It is a killing of fellow human beings, extermination of fellow human beings by fellow human beings. That is the tragic part of this. So it's very difficult. We will carry on. My name is Zahid Makhdoom. I am on a board of the Hari Sharma Foundation as well as South Asian Film Education Society. I live in downtown Vancouver and I work in downtown Vancouver as a public servant. My task this morning is to welcome you all, to acknowledge your beautiful presence on these beautiful lands of Squamish and Musqueam people, and to respectfully honor and acknowledge the presence of two incredible resources, two incredible human beings that at least I have come across in my life, David Barsamian and Alan Whitehorn. I had met Alan for the first time. However, from the time of my being with the NDP before I became whatever I'm doing now, I was a member of NDP and I was a candidate in 1993, one of those sacrificial people that lead to the slaughterhouse, knowing that the Reform Party is going to take all the seats in Alberta. And I was one of those sacrificial lamb. We used to study him, we used to read his essays and articles. Those were inspiring, especially about the history of CCF and NDP. He is a very well-known academic, a great resource in Canada who has written extensively on Armenian Genocide. And with the Armenian Genocide, what we are dealing with, not only we are dealing with a genocide, but we are dealing with a continual process by a state, a juggernaut state, a powerful state that probably still considers itself as a sultanate or an empire that continues to deny that something this horrible was perpetrated by this state. We have David Barsamian. Both of these comrades have been involved for years, for decades, basically in public education, not only on the issues of Armenia, but on the issues that are plaguing other communities and other people. What we will do this morning is Dr. Whitehorn will speak for about 15-20 minutes, however long he wishes to take. But within that, within the bookend is there, right? So, and then we will have David talk about, amongst other things, about an incredible person who is his mother, and he had the privilege of recording one of her talks at one of the universities. She was a survivor. She saw with her own eyes murder of 15-year-olds and 14-years-old, all of these people who are currently, we know that there are some parts in the world, it has been deemed that any person who is, any male person who is of 14, 15-year-old is a good target in the war against terrorism. So that was the manifestation of that war in those days. 15, 14-year-olds were the target, and his mother witnessed it, and he will be talking about that. So once again, grateful to you for your kindness. Once again, grateful to you for your beautiful presence, and thank you for being here.
Good morning, Bharat. I'd like to thank the conference organizers, Dr. Banerjee, for hosting this. SANSAD and SFU are great hosts, and their alliance of progressive organizations are putting on a wonderful 3-day conference. I'm going to talk about the Armenian Genocide and the emergence of the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide. We should remember which genocides are remembered and written about and which ones are not, and why. And I appreciate the efforts of the conference organizers to try to broaden the scope of what genocides are written about and discussed. And I would just remind you that the Armenian deportations and massacres that began in earnest in 1915 and continued during World War I and even in some ways after, was much discussed in the world press and amongst the diplomats and even military personnel in 1915 onwards. And we have the famous declaration by Tsarist Russia, France, and Great Britain warning Turkey against the crimes against humanity that were going on. And in May 1915, we have the first major introduction of the concept of crimes against humanity. Now, there was much that was written about. There was much that was done to help the orphans of the genocide. There were over 100,000 orphans, and they were helped from one year after another throughout the Near East. Near East Relief was a major American organization to help those who were helpless. But as we went from the 1920s into the 1950s and beyond, a genocide that had been covered so extensively before the term was created, but was nevertheless described in horrific terms, describing the indescribable, if you like. By the 1950s, much of the world had forgotten, and there was often references to the Armenian genocide as the forgotten genocide. So we went from very high profile during World War I and after to, by half a century later, the forgotten genocide. Now, I'm pleased to say that 100 years after the genocide, 101 actually, it is very much remembered by more and more of the world. But you might want to think about why we remember and don't remember, and what role, if any, state denial has in that. The passage of time, changing borders, changing names, often deliberate changing of names. Now, I try, when I'm doing my work on genocide, to also bring in the concept of crimes against humanity, because, first of all, it's a term that was introduced relating to the Armenian genocide, but also because it's in many ways a more comprehensive net than the concept of genocide to capture the perpetrators and punish them. It includes more groups, and it includes individuals. Genocide is only targeting certain groups: ethnic, racial, religious, or national. There's a lot of groups that are left out. Genocide covers important things, but it doesn't cover enough. And similarly, we have the concept of war crimes. And the International Criminal Court, often when they charge individuals who are guilty, use the three concepts: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And I always remind people, you know, Al Capone, who conducted multiple murders was convicted of income tax evasion. So it's not as satisfying to the victim group, but whatever net works to get the perpetrators, let's use it. And the more nets, the more mechanisms we have, the better. Now, I've handed out, because 15 minutes is not long to do a complex subject from 101 years ago, or today in some ways, because in some ways, aspects of the genocide, particularly the denial, continue. I provided a handout of 8 items. Several of them are from the newly published Armenian Genocide Encyclopedia that I edited over the last 6 years. And it's the first ever. You might want to think about why it took 100 years for the first ever encyclopedia about the Armenian Genocide to be published. And usually when we're talking about genocide, like other important topics, we have the journalistic or the academic W5 questions. Who, where, when, what, why, and we can add how. So we begin with who are the Armenians? And this is always a dilemma when you're talking about victim group, because inasmuch as genocide is successful, the victim group is smaller, more scattered, and maybe harder to survive and thrive. The Armenians are from the lands surrounding Mount Ararat in the South Caucasus. They were the first state, or the first nation to embrace Christianity in 301. And they have a unique language and alphabet. And in one of the handouts, you can see the verbs of genocide poem in English and in Armenian. You can see how different the script is. At its peak, the Armenian state, when it had independence, went from the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the Black Sea in the north and the Caspian Sea in the east, so roughly a triangle. Now, over the centuries, the Armenian people were often the victims of competing empires, rival empires invading armies, and this is often the fate of nations that are smaller in number. And so we see that the Armenians were caught between the Greeks and the Persians, between Rome and Persia, between Russia and Persia, between Ottoman Empire and Tsarist Russia. On the eve of World War I, the Armenian people, the Armenian nation was divided into 2 competing empires, the Tsarist Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The western half of the Armenian nation was in the Ottoman Empire, and the eastern half was under the Tsarist Empire. And neither empires, the nature of empires is to dominate and subjugate other peoples, right? That's the nature of empire. So neither the Tsarist Empire nor the Ottoman Empire were particularly conducive to ethnic and linguistic and religious tolerance. But the genocide occurred not in the Tsarist half, but in the Ottoman half. And that's very, very important to remember. Now, when we look at factors explaining the rise of genocide, the causes of genocide, we can differentiate long-term, short-term, and there are usually lots and lots of factors, but I've highlighted 4 key ones. And you can decide whether these are similar to the causes of genocide elsewhere in the world. First, you had an enormously rigid ethnic and religious inequality in the Ottoman Empire. It was an autocratic regime. It was a theocratic regime where one religion had a higher, superior status, and the subject nations, the subject religious minorities, had far less rights. They were subjects, not citizens. This is one of the hardest concepts to teach to students in the 21st century, is the notion of a subject as opposed to a citizen, right? Basically, a subject had to obey often unjust laws, often unjust decrees. Now, the Ottoman Empire was one of the major empires of the last several thousand years. And at its peak, it was in North Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. But by the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, it had declined sufficiently that the number of diverse ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire had diminished as the Russian Empire expanded, as many of the Balkan states gained their independence. Now, the consequences of the Russian Tsarist expansion and Balkan states gaining their independence was the Muslims from those lands fled the repressive new regimes. And so you had people on the move, people who had lost their homes, lost their careers, very angry. So over 1 million refugees, Muslim refugees, came into that shrinking Ottoman Empire. And the state, the Ottoman state, deliberately put them into the lands that were historically the Armenian lands. Now, this is just adding fuel to the fire, right? Now, from the Ottoman regime point of view, it was putting fellow Muslims on the borders and making the lands more, if you like, friendly. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire, there was growing frustration, growing anger. You had this large displaced population from the Balkans and the southern parts of the expanding Tsarist Empire. And the Christians were seen as unreliable and scapegoats. You had to blame somebody. And if you were a forced refugee, you're not going to differentiate between a Serb Christian, a Croat Christian, or an Armenian Christian, right? So there was a tendency to scapegoat Christians, period. So you have a state inflaming ethnic intolerance and making a deliberate policy of population relocation, based in part because of the urgency of the migration, of forced migration of people. Now, as is often in the case of the history of Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, you had a coup, a violent revolution in 1908, and the Young Turks came to power. And the Young Turks were basically young military leaders who were unhappy with the decline of the empire, the old order that seemed inefficient, unable to stand up against the Europeans and others. And they thought they could modernize the empire, make it more efficient, more forceful, and expand the empire east back to Central Asia to compensate for the lost Balkan lands. Then the Young Turks' ideology was an intolerant form of nationalism. It was an expansionist policy of rebuilding an empire, conquering other peoples, in the goal of creating a pan-Turan. And it made extensive use of the army, the police, and special killing organizations to eliminate the Armenians. Now, those conditions would be sufficient, perhaps, but one key catalyst occurred that is the fourth factor, and that was World War I. War can often bring out the worst in state secrecy, arbitrariness, the sense of panic, the sense of feeling vulnerable. You lash out whoever your enemies, both external and suspected, accurate or not, suspected internal enemies. The Ottoman Empire felt threatened from Russia in the east, Britain and France and their fleets in the Mediterranean, the Arab revolt in the south, and the Greeks and Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. Now, 1915 is that fateful year, and we can see the phases of genocide. It was planned in secret. The regime lied about their intentions, So there was denial at the outset. And there were public state telegrams sent, and there were private party regime telegrams that contradicted the public telegrams. So you had kind of a public relations facade. And basically, those Armenian men who had been conscripted for the war were disarmed, sent into labor battalions where they worked like donkeys to carry loads, insufficient clothing, insufficient food. Many died fairly quickly from those conditions, but a great number of those conscripts, Armenian conscripts, were shot dead. So the men of military age were eliminated first. We have the law of deportations, temporary relocation. Don't worry, after the war, things will be fine, is publicly stated. Women and children and elderly were given 1 or 2 days' notice, not allowed to take very much, and sent on forced marches through the mountains and through the deserts of what is now Turkey, Syria, and parts of Iraq. And sometimes they were sent on deliberately circuitous routes. The goal was not to arrive at a destination, the goal was to kill them. And there was no setup of facilities for the women, the children, and the elderly. In that same year, we have the law of confiscation. Armenian properties, cattle, household goods were officially claimed by the state. Don't worry, they said, you'll get it back after the war. We'll keep a master list. In fact, usually the mobs, neighbors, grab the stuff, bargain sale. Kind of reminds me of the Japanese-Canadian plight during World War II, right? At the end, about 1.5 million Armenians died, either from exposure, starvation, disease, or outright killing. Many of the women were raped. Some of the women and children were stolen and taken into other families, Islamic families. Some were saved. A number of the Armenians who lived were saved by honest and very brave Islamic citizens, because the Turkish government said, you help an Armenian, your whole family will be punished at risk of death. How many of us would risk our families? It's one thing for me to risk my life, which I do from time to time, depending on where I'm going and what the nature of the regime is. But my family, my grandchildren, that's a different story. I'm a lot more cautious about my grandchildren than I am about myself, right? When we look at the genocide, it stopped in some ways. The killing stopped in some ways. But how? Foreign armies, the British and the French. It didn't stop from the regime changing its mind or running out of steam. And so you have to ask the question, hard power, as unpleasant as it is, may be necessary to intervene to save vulnerable ethnic, religious, racial communities. And we have the concept today of responsibility to protect, which the Canadian government and the Australian government help promote. As imperfect as a concept is and how it can be misused, it is an important future tool, I would argue. The harsh demographic reality is that there are more Armenians in the diaspora than in Turkey today. About 50,000 Armenians, vulnerable Armenians in Turkey today. Over 1,000 churches and monasteries were destroyed. We talk about cultural genocide. And Article 301 of the Turkish criminal law can charge you for insulting Turkishness. And insulting Turkishness can be a variety of things included, but one is to talk about the Armenian Genocide. And I would just conclude my initial talk by just saying this. The attempt to silence is not only in Turkey today, 101 years later, directed at academics, civil society types, human rights activists, but reaches out across the globe. Every major Armenian genocide scholar that I know who's been in the field for at least 10 years has received threats to his or herself or family, myself included. 8 years ago, the Turkish government tried to silence me in Canada, threatened me with loss of my job, and even worse, threatened the Canadian government if they didn't silence me. And you won't hear me say very much positive about the Harper government. But this is one time that stubborn man did something right. I said no, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm able to stand here today because of other people standing up in solidarity. And we need to stand up in solidarity for those in Turkey today, because they are much more vulnerable. And I will come back after David has spoken and talk about my own family and my Metzmama, my grandmother. Thank you.
Բարելույս, ինչպես եք, հրամեցեք, շատ ուրախ եմ, որ ինձի կանչեցիք հոս, և մեր լեզուն շատ հարուստ է, և շատ ալվոր բարեր ունիմ. I wanted to use Armenian, this exotic Indo-European language that is its own tree in the family of languages. It's very rich and has a long tradition. So I want to echo our brother Eldon and sister Marianne, who emphasize the importance of maintaining language. It's a precious resource. So I was pretty lucky. I grew up in New York, where I was born. My parents spoke to me in Armenian, but I always responded in English because, you know, I wanted to be an American. Hey, I wasn't one of those foreigners. But enough of it sank into the cobwebs of my brain that I'm still able to speak in Armenian. I'd like to thank very much SANSAD Zindabad, Joy SANSAD, and in particular Chin Banerjee. I'm going to embarrass him now. I know a few people in North America more dedicated to peace and justice than Chin. And I think he deserves an enormous round of applause from all of us. I do a radio program out of Boulder, Colorado called Alternative Radio. It's broadcast across Canada from Halifax to Victoria, and you can hear it locally on CFRO 100.5 FM every Wednesday from noon to 1. And I'm going to hand out a sign-up list so that you can know more about alternative radio. And while supplies last, and I don't think they'll last very long, I have a 1-hour program that I did with Robert Fisk, who talks about the Armenian Holocaust, and then my mother's eyewitness testimony, some of which you'll hear. So those are up here, and we can start. There is one condition, though. and that is that you write clearly. Some of you remember penmanship that are old enough. I have to say this in the age of Twitter and the internet and texting, that it's very difficult sometimes when I return to Boulder to read the scribblings of different people. So please, if you could share your email, I'd be most appreciative. Now, last night we had a brilliant presentation, a keynote speech from Mr. Dieng of Senegal, who's worked for the UN, and I think he hit upon many important points. I'm not going to review his speech, but you can find it. I think it'll be on YouTube after the conference. And that is the whole issue of who controls memory. What is history? An objective collection of facts? Who collects these facts? You know, there's an African proverb that if the elephants wrote the history of the hunt, the outcome would be very different. And so we find this particular issue, the genocide of the Armenians, still 101 years later, highly contested. It is a battleground. It is combat. You have a full-page ads taken out in the Wall Street Journal by a Turkish lobby saying that the Armenian genocide was invented, it's a fabrication. Yes, a few people died, but you know it was World War I. What could we do? Many Turks died, yada, yada, yada. And then a few days after that particular ad was published in the Wall Street Journal, Kim Kardashian, you know who she is, the most famous Armenian in the world, she took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, genocide denial cannot be allowed, you know, refuting the Turkish official state position. Now, I think also it's important, as in the case with Indigenous peoples in Canada, the role of racism in the formulation of the other. So the Armenians were othered, as it were. Edward Said used that term very much in Orientalism. They were the Untermenschen. They were literally the scapegoats, as was mentioned, for the decline of the Turkish Empire. And they were a convenient and vulnerable target. Now, last year was the 100th anniversary. I was in Istanbul and in Ankara, the capital, and in Van, all the way in the east, in the historic Armenian area, right near the Iranian border. And on that occasion in Istanbul, in Istiklal, the big shopping street off of Taksim Square, if you've been there, many fancy shops and, you know, stores. There was a demonstration of diaspora Armenians, as well as only a few Istanbuli Armenians were present. And I think that speaks to the fear that they have of coming out, of being visible. And there was a decent number, we're talking hundreds here, not thousands, a decent number of kindred spirits from the Turkish and Kurdish communities coming out in solidarity. Then we went, some of us went to Ankara. There was a large event there. Again, large means a room of this size was filled, okay, about 200 or 300 people supporting veracity, supporting the truth of history. And I have to tell you, I was very, very much moved when, unprovoked, without my saying anything, the Kurdish mayor of Diyarbakir, which is the historic Armenian town of Dikanaget, where my mother is from, he volunteered to say to me, with no prompting, I am ashamed of what my grandparents did to the Armenians. And then I went to another town near my mother's village, a town of Dicle, where the mayor there said, every time I meet an Armenian, I feel shame in my heart. You know, even now I'm choking up. That humanity, that solidarity, that apology meant so much. You know, I couldn't express my appreciation and gratitude. And of course, denial is the final stage of genocide. It's never acknowledging the truth. It doesn't allow for closure. And that is what this regime, which is a major ally of the world's greatest democracy, the United States of America, its president, Tayyip Erdogan, has continued to maintain that there was no genocide and, you know, these were wartime conditions and things, you know, unfortunately some people died. Let me tell you what happened last April 24th. I mean, this, you talk about historical engineering. We're in Istanbul, there's another group of, you know, comrades, and at the same time, there was an enormously orchestrated pageant in Gallipoli. Remember the Mel Gibson movie, Gallipoli? A major battle of World War I when Australian and New Zealand troops were landed on the Turkish coast in an operation to end the war. Supposedly they would march on Constantinople, the regime would fall, Turkey would be out of the war, Germany would lose one of its major allies in the war. Well, these mostly Australian and New Zealand troops were cannon fodder for the well-placed Turkish positions on the slopes overlooking the beachheads in Gallipoli. So Erdogan, the now, I'll call him a dictator, that's what he is, he created this event. Why? To deflect attention from worldwide celebrations of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. So he invited this fool, Prince Charles, to go there, as well as other representatives from the Turkic states, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, etc. And so what's really interesting is, historically, this day was always marked in Turkish history as a holiday, but when? In February, when the landings occurred. So he deliberately moved this holiday to April 24th in order to deflect any attention to the Armenian genocide issue. So the past, you know, as William Faulkner says, the past is never dead. It's not even past. It lives among us, and it influences and shapes us in various ways. And how memory is contested. The bloody massacre in Bangladesh quickly covered over the memory of the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. The assassination of Allende drowned out the groans of Bangladesh. The war in the Sinai Desert made people forget Allende. The Cambodian massacre made people forget Sinai. And so on and so on and so forth, until ultimately everyone lets everything be forgotten. It's Milan Kundera, the great Czech writer, from the Book of Laughter and Forgetting. We cannot forget the past. It is an area of contestation. It is an area, if you will, of combat. And the influences, of course, of the genocide of the Armenians were not lost on the Nazis. Hitler, just before launching his legions upon Poland in 1939, said, because some of his generals were already a little bit leery about what their actual military operation was going to consist of. It wasn't just going to be warfare. It was going to consist of rounding up Jews and killing them, rounding up communists, rounding up socialists, trade union, gay people. You know, this didn't quite sit so well with some of these, you know, high-ranking members of the German military. And Hitler assured them, don't worry, who today speaks today of the extermination of the Armenians? Now, how would this obscure man from Austria know about the genocide of the Armenians? Well, his very good friend happened to be the council in Erzurum, which is in the eastern part of what is today Turkey in the Armenian heartland. His very good friend was Erwin von Schuber-Richter. And he sent back reports to the Kaiser, to the German Foreign Office in Berlin about the situation that was going on in Turkey. I'll just read you a few lines. I have conducted a series of conversations with influential Turkish people, and these are my impressions. A large segment of the Young Turk Party, that was referred to by Alan in his presentation, that would be, let's name names, Enver Pasha, Talat, and Jamal. This was the troika. This was the triumvirate that engineered the Armenian Holocaust. They are the ones responsible. Were they ever held to account? Never. There was no tribunal. And as I happen to be from the United States, I'm living in a country where major war criminals are walking around. They're not only walking around, they're getting $500,000 speaking fees on major colleges and universities. They write books. They're interviewed on National Public Radio. They're treated with dignity, whereas they should be in jail. They should have been prosecuted for war crimes, which is what the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and the bombing of Syria and Somalia and Yemen. And should I go on? Do I have to tell this audience? Canadians know more about what's going on in the United States and US policies than most Americans do, by the way. And this is not unusual, where you find a kind of almost colonial situation where it's important to know what's going on with this big behemoth below the 49th parallel. So we have people like George W. Bush and Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and Donald Rumsfeld walking around, who should be, by any account, by any objective understanding of what is international law, they should all be in The Hague. Now, the Americans are very self-righteous when it comes to international law, but they use it very selectively. So they can be, pounding their breasts about how virtuous they are, about Balkan atrocities and atrocities in Darfur, etc. But when it comes to them, they have a permanent free pass. That is one of the, I hesitate to use the words benefits, it's one of the aspects of being an imperial power. Law does not apply to you. So it was mentioned that responsibility to protect has now, entered the international political discourse. I would be very careful when the United States of America invokes this term. They invoked it in Libya. You remember that there was going to be a massacre, there was going to be a genocide. We have to protect, because we love the Libyan Arab people. We're so close to Islam and Muslim traditions. And so the US then engineered votes at the UN to protect the Libyan people. Well, look at the situation 5 years later. As Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died, he being Gaddafi. The Libyan state is completely smashed. It's in 3 separate zones, basically, each one fighting the other. The same thing in Iraq. It has ceased to exist as a viable state. And so we have to be, I think, rigorous and very careful when we apply this term, and be skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical when a big power likes to invoke, international law, which it never applies to itself. Now, these are a lot of facts and figures, and, I think when you hear someone's voice that lived through the Armenian Genocide, it can have quite a different impact. And I'm not going to try and trump my mother. I just want to tell you that her name was Araksi Giragosyan. Actually, her given first name was Khanım. But after the genocide, that was considered too Turkish a name. Khanım means like madame or bibi or lady, right? And so her aunt gave her the name of Araksi, which is one of the historic rivers of Armenia. Her parents, my grandparents, who I never knew, unfortunately, were Giragos and Mariam Giragosyan. Her younger brothers were Sakis, Mardiros, Hovsep, and Tavit, my name, Tavit, David. Unaware of the looming calamity about to envelop her, she remembers an omen. She was born in 1905, so this recollection takes place in 1915. Early in 1950, her village was covered with locusts. The elders said it was a bad sign. A few months later, the wheat was ripe and about to be harvested when the end came. The Turks came to the village, took all the men and young boys, marched them outside of town, and shot them. The remaining women and children were told to assemble at the church. They were going to be resettled, deported, exiled to the uninhabitable desert wastes hundreds of miles to the south. Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria, a place I've visited as a matter of fact. They were to walk to their new homes. Promises that they would be protected en route were quickly broken. The defenseless caravans were waylaid and attacked throughout the deportation march. Girls in particular were targeted and kidnapped. And my mother remembers her mother putting coal on her face and cutting her hair and pushing it up and putting her in boys' clothes so that she would not be kidnapped, and hid her under blankets as well during the deportation march. And so Araksi walked all the way to the city of Urfa, where she was separated from her mother, brothers, and other relatives. She eventually found her way into an orphanage in Aleppo, a very important city in Armenian history. And she was in an orphanage there for 6 years. And in August 1921, she married my father, Bedros Barsamian in Beirut. 3 months later, they were living in a tenement walk-up on Horatio Street in New York's West Village. The following year, at 17, she had the first of her 4 children. And so in 1986, I was asked by a history professor at the University of Colorado at Denver to give a lecture on the Armenian genocide. And I said, well, sure, I could do it, but you know what? My mother's coming next week. Why don't you invite her? She's an eyewitness, and I think it'll have a big impact on your students. So fortunately, I was there with the tape recorder, and we're going to hear now my mother, Araksi.
When we left, my family was 25 in a family. They took all the men folks. They asked my father, where's your ammunition? He says, I sold it. So he says, go get it. So when he went in a Kurd town to get it, they beat him and they took him all his clothes, and they didn't, when he came back, this is my mother tells me a story. When he came back, bare body, he went in a jail. They cut his arms. Where's the ammunition? He says, I haven't got it. They didn't give me. So he died in a jail. And all the men, they took all the men in the field. They tied their hands and they shoot it, killed it. Every one of them. I remember they collect the only 15 years old boys left, just like this. They were sitting and their hands are tied back, and they took in the field. They shoot them too. Nothing left, only women and small children. We were in
Deported.
We deported in some city, bare food, nothing to eat. They took everything from us. They say, we put in a church, when you come back, we'll give you back, which is not true. So we went to some city, my aunt gave a birth. She left her baby over there, and then we walk. So many, no water. I remember my mother used her handkerchief in horse urine, and wipe our mouth. We were so dry. Just think that. And then in Chitzim, I forgot lots of things. If I remember things day and night, I tell not finish. And then we came Diyarbakir. We sit there. My mother covered me with a blanket. They took all the good-looking ladies, young ladies and girls. They captured it, you know. My mother put my 3 young brothers atop of me so they wouldn't see me. So from there, and then the news came that Kaimakam, what's Kaimakam means?
Like a governor.
Governor says that we forgive, take it to Dikrisket and throw all these ladies in Dikrisket.
The Tigris River.
Tigris River. So I remember very well, it was a moon, and then Jandarma came. Jandarma was cop.
It's kind of police.
Police came, says, government is forgive them, take this different city. And we walk in night, and we walk, we came in city that they were very well Turk. Ooh, they were very well. Also my aunt saved me into the blanket, they would not capture me. I had a girlfriend, she had the hair long as hair, and Jandarma came, they grab it with the hair and throw it in back of him. And horse. And they gave us a bread that made from the hay. But we got to eat because we were hungry. Took some month, you know, we came there. And then we came Urfa, they call it. Big, every refugee was in Urfa. And my mother got sick. Also, they want us to move from there. So my grandmother made herself sick and stay by mother. 3 children, one my aunt, 5, 6 children around my mother. And my aunt grabbed me and we went. We went to Aleppo, Syria. My later on, I met my grandmother. They took her to Deir Zor with main thing. Deir Zor is, they killed so many Armenians over there. Most Armenians they kill in Deir Zor.
Shad Shanagalem, merci beaucoup, shukran jazilan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My appreciation for the organizers, my appreciation to both presenters. I am an Armenian genocide survivor. My grandfather, who witnessed the killing of his entire family, was later on saved by a Kurdish shepherd and taken to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, there were 40 orphans who eventually were adopted by the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and taken to Ethiopia. Recently, there was a professor from Italy who came to Ethiopia to study the 40 orphans' history to make a point to the United Nations that it is undeniable fact that in fact genocide happened. My question is about denial. We know, or all of us have some ideas why the Turkish government denies. I want to hear from you why 101 years later the Turkish government is still denying the Armenian genocide, while you have countries like Germany who have acknowledged the Holocaust, other nations, civilized nations. What is the main reason, or the reasons? We know, but we like to hear from you and for the public to hear why up to this day there is this systematic, unbelievable effort to deny what happened to the Armenian people and the loss of 1.5 million poor Armenians. Thank you.
Go first.
Well, look, all states have myths about themselves. They invent a narrative of the past. Canada is no different. The United States is no different in trying to create an image that is noble, that is full of good intentions, benign intent. Yes, perhaps we treated our native peoples not well, but really their heart was in the right place. And that kind of BS that goes on. All states do it, and Turkey is no different. But in this particular instance, I think there's another element of machismo at work, because the Turkish self-image is one of a warrior class that is, highly militaristic, being militaristic, but also being very kind and compassionate. So that's one aspect of this. Then you have the other, just the absolute fact of the modern Turkish Republic, which was founded in 1923 by Kemal Mustafa Atatürk, was built on the ruins of the Armenian civilization. So the Armenian lands, not just lands, which were considerable, orchards, fruit trees, etc., but factories, ateliers, workshops, tools, all of this was confiscated and became the bedrock of wealth for the new Turkish state. That's another issue, of course, is about compensation, not just acknowledgement, but what kind of compensation can be paid to the victims, the survivors. I don't like to use the word victim very much because it conveys a sense of helplessness, and I don't feel helpless. I feel active. So I think that's really important psychologically, not to get caught up in victimhood. I have suffered, I am so poor, etc. We should try to overcome that. So the issue, this goes on right to today, where some Armenians want land back, some want money, compensation. People like me who are well settled in the United States, are not going to go back to our ancestral homes. That's just a non-starter. I visited there. It's a Kurdish village now, Zaza Kurds, about 500 of them, including one who said openly that he knew he was Armenian. I said, how did you know? My grandmother told me before I died that they converted to Islam in order to save their lives. Many, many hidden Armenians exist in Turkey today. It's a big story. There are more and more books being written about this. Alan mentioned the figure of 50,000 Armenians in Turkey. The actual number may be 10 times that. No one really knows. A lot of, as was mentioned, a Kurdish shepherd was saved a family. Others were in similar circumstances. So the US, by the way, again, my great country, the beacon of freedom and democracy, supports the Turkish position. So I was there last April 24th at the centenary of the genocide. And so Germany, Turkey's #1 ally in World War I, comes out and acknowledges the genocide. Austria, Turkey's #2 ally in World War I, comes out and recognizes the genocide. The Pope, the Vatican, recognized the genocide. The Turks were getting really nervous. Will it finally happen? will Barack Obama acknowledge the Armenian genocide, as he did so eloquently before he became president when he was campaigning? And the Turks were really nervous about this because the US is their big military ally. You know, it's the big enchilada. And then April 24th came and went, and the US issued a pathetic resolution about, you know, full of euphemisms about the tragedy of the Armenians, and it was so sad, and, you know, our condolences go on, but no acknowledgement of the word genocide. This has huge diplomatic as well as legal ramifications, which the Turks are very fearful of. And so that, I think, you know, maybe Alan has something to add to that, but I think that's kind of the background.
I agree with everything David has said. Psychologically, it's hard for us to acknowledge what our ancestors might have done that would dishonor us, that we're embarrassed about, we don't want to pass on to our children or grandchildren. So there's a psychological factor. It's still an autocratic state that tries to decree what its official history is. It's still an ethnic nationalism that's intolerant of minorities, such as the Kurds. So it has little desire to look back in history and be tolerant towards other minorities. There's an economic factor, the fear of reparations, and there's a territorial factor. Turkey reacted to the proposed Treaty of Sèvres, which was intended to partition Turkey. And the Treaty of Lausanne basically guaranteed the territorial integrity of Turkey at the expense of the Kurds and the Armenians. The Turkish government today and all preceding Turkish governments all the way back to the end of World War I does not want to reopen the land question. So there are multiple factors, but I think on the reparations, on the correcting of the distortions of history, in the memorial sites that could be recognized and plaques put so that people are reminded how many suffered, how many died, and how many cultural properties, including more than 1,000 monasteries and churches, were destroyed.
I just want to add one thing. You all heard about the July 15th coup in Turkey, the failed coup, right? Well, there's been, you know, multiple reports in the Turkish media, largely controlled by Erdogan, by the way, that Fethullah Gulen, he is this former ally of Erdogan. He's a cleric himself. He runs a kind of a mosaic school network in the US, and I don't know if they're in Canada as well. They may be indeed. They are, yeah. There's reports going in the Turkish press today that Gulen is really Armenian. And his father was Armenian and his mother was Jewish. So bringing in the two great scapegoats to, you know, further demonize Gulen. And when I was in Turkey a couple of years ago, I've been there multiple times, Erdogan, who's an out-and-out racist, he was giving a talk, and I forget exactly the context, but there was some criminal activity, and it was, someone was accused of this, and he said something like, well, it must have been an Armenian, and everybody laughed in the audience. They get the joke. You know, these are Untermenschen. They're a punching bag for the Turkish state whenever they need to find someone to explain what's going on. Does it sound familiar? Historically, we have a lot of examples of that, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much for your... Grateful to Dr. Whitehorn and my brother David for their thoughtful reflections, which they freely shared. We are very thankful. CDs are here. Outside there is also
More reprints.
a Radical Desi magazine is available if you wish to take one home for your reading pleasure. Great writing in it as well. Once again, thankful to you. We will take